This happened in October of 2015. As a positive response to the state's budget cuts in natural resources, Ruth Oppedahl decided to use her vacation exploring our state from north to south and meeting with conservation groups and citizens along the way to learn how they help protect our lands, waters, and wildlife. She discovered a beautiful wild river and wonderful people along the way. And our newsletter had a contact that you can get to find a log of the trip. Ruth is dear to my heart, the Executive Director of the Natural Resources Foundation of Wisconsin. I happen to be on the board of directors of Bird City. Bird City has benefited big time over the past several years. We thank you so much for that, Ruth. It's a nonprofit organization that makes grants for managing public lands and research and monitoring on rare species in Wisconsin, and coordinates a renowned field trip program throughout the state. How many field trips this year?
This year there's 210, and several of them have multiple sessions. Yeah, the registration's next week.
It's amazing. Yes, I've been lucky enough to have been leader on 2 of those trips, and they're always well organized except mine. And so we'll hear more about that, I'm sure. This woman loves the Wisconsin River, okay? Welcome her, Ruth Oppedahl.
Well, thanks everyone for coming tonight. It's just a pleasure to be back in Stevens Point because I did my graduate studies here in environmental education, and I just love Stevens Point. I lived out at Suez for 1 year, and then one summer I lived here in town, and just really love this town. And I had a wonderful experience when I paddled through here, and I'll share with you a little bit the story of even the point part of the story, which was one day out of 18. And so I'd like to share with you about the 18-day journey down the Wisconsin River, why I did it, and how it worked, and what didn't work. And also I'd like to share, because this is an Audubon Society, I grew up with the Cedar Rapids Audubon Club, and as a child I was on field trips with my mother and my grandmother all the time. And I remember in junior high getting dragged out of bed at like 4:30 in the morning to do the Christmas bird count in Lynn County, Iowa. So I often make sure that people realize that was a real defining experience for me as a child that I'm sure sent me into this career and life of working in conservation. So I'm just delighted to be here, and I know we have many, many members here, and I'm going to tell some stories on a few members as we go through. And also, when we get to the end, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our Birdathon and how that helps raise money for Bird City, Wisconsin, and how it raises money for bird monitoring, if you know Ryan Brady, and many other worthwhile bird habitat and studies and research that happens in Wisconsin. But first, we'll go on the journey, because that's why everybody's here on the Wisconsin River. So in 2015, we went through a budget session pretty much like this last one we just went through, where there were major cuts to conservation. And it was really a battle, because not only were there cuts to the state parks, where they no longer have any property taxes supporting the parks, but there were also cuts to $1 million in cuts to nonprofit groups like the River Alliance and the Ice Age Trail and the ATV Safety Group and our foundation and many others. And it was really frustrating, because we were able to have the Joint Finance Committee put that funding back in, and then it was vetoed out on the final day. And there were also cuts to our scientists in the Department of Natural Resources, who do a lot of the important research. And I'll share with you one of the projects that I learned about as I came down the river that actually was just along the river at Aldo Leopold's shack. So there's a couple bird stories in here, and then at the end I'd like to share with you a little bit about some of the other bird activities that the foundation does. So what happened when that budget passed, we have been keeping all of our members informed, the Natural Resources Foundation makes grants. That's a big thing we do for public lands and for rare species, a lot of bird support. Excuse me. And we also run this field trip program. And I have the books back there. Feel free to take them with you. But when I came into the office Monday morning after learning of the veto on Sunday, I just put my head down on my desk, and then the phone started ringing. Ring, ring. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I kind of let it slip. I was so upset. I wanted to do something to bring attention to these cuts because I felt like there were a lot of other cuts that happened, including $800 million to public education, which had been removed from the budget, and the university had lost a lot of funding. So some of the conservation cuts maybe didn't get as much attention. And so I kind of let it slip at a staff meeting that I thought, I'm not sure, it keeps going to the owl, but it's a great picture of a great I let it slip at a staff meeting like, I think instead of going to the Boundary Waters this year, I think I'm going to paddle down the Wisconsin River. And it was kind of like, you know, when you go down to Madison from here, you cross the river a lot of times. And I had been living in Bayfield County, and you cross the river at least 5 times. And especially near Merrill there, it's just a beautiful stretch. And I had always said when I was driving by, I'm going to paddle that one day. And I just never did it, you know. Probably everyone else says that too. You know, you go through Wausau, there's a beautiful stretch there at the end of town on the south end. And I finally said, I think I'll just do the Wisconsin. I didn't know how long it was. I didn't actually know if I could do it or not. Which, you know, and the problem was I had mentioned this in a staff meeting, and my coworkers would not let it die. They're like, you're going, you are going to do that. And they said, and we will help you do that. So I was kind of committed, and I went home and I saw, oh, it's 430 miles, you know. And I'm a paddler, I've been a paddler for a long time, but I just, you know, I wanted to do it alone. I sort of had this image of, you know, one woman against the world. And I thought, how can I do this in a way that will make it a valuable experience? And I said, what I'll do is I'll paddle from north to south. This river is completely within the boundary of Wisconsin. Starts up there at the UP, and then the confluence of the Mississippi is down here at Prairie du Chien. And it's an old traditional waterway that has been traveled as a highway by people for probably thousands of years. And in fact, the river runners, the lumbermen, when they would come down with either the logs or the cut lumber in rafts and came down through here, they'd get to Prairie du Chien and they would walk back up to Rhinelander or Eagle River. So I thought, yeah, if they could do that, and sometimes if it was high water, they'd do it twice in a spring. I thought, if they can do that, I can go downstream. So anyhow, this was one of the reasons I did it. I thought, you know, if I can do this solo, and every town I get to, I'm going to meet with the media, and I'm going to talk with them about these conservation cuts. So that was what my goal was. Ended up being a little bit different, but this is my boat. It's called a full boat is the brand. These were used in World War II because you can just pack them up into 2 packages, put them on an airplane. Then you open up the frame. There's our dog Laker, he's supervising. And you end up with a very seaworthy vehicle. And in fact, in World War II, the Americans would sneak up on German supply boats in these kayaks, put bombs with magnets on the boat, and then they would quietly paddle away. And there's some very famous stories about kayakers who did that. So this was a full boat, a skin-on frame boat. There are good things about it, and one is it can hold a lot of gear, and I want it to be self-sufficient. So that means take all your food that you need for 18 days. Take your tent, sleeping bag, and everything. And so you can fit a lot of, I don't know if I'm doing that, or... The owl really likes us. Thanks for the water. So it was a good boat for me to use. I put together a mile chart. This is where it started to get real about all the road crossings, all the towns, how many miles in between each one, so I would have some idea when nighttime came on, if there was some public land that I could camp on. Everybody was worried about my safety as a single woman. I'm obviously not like a marathon athlete or anything. And I think people were really worried about my safety, so I had lots of safety gear, including that orange thing that is actually a little beacon that talks with a satellite, and you can send a message, I'm okay. I had a message I could send that was would say, I'm on the water now. I had one that said, I'm safe in camp. And then there's a little button here, SOS. And you only do that one if you are in big trouble. And then the helicopters come in. It's actually an international rescue thing that happens. Well, it turns out for most of the Wisconsin River, if something happens, you just stand up. I started on September 28th. I went into October. It was a low water year, and a lot of times I was pulling my boat because there was not enough water. This is an example of some of how this signal would go to a website, and then my friends and family and then my coworkers started putting this up on a blog online, and then they started putting. Someone had given me a iPhone, and I took photos, and then automatically whenever I went by a tower, they would be downloading it, and so they started putting together these journals every day, which I didn't really know was happening. So it was interesting. And they also put on recordings, because I would dictate at night. I'd wake up and I would just dictate the best 3 things of that previous day. And they just put the recordings on there, so I'm glad my language wasn't too salty. You start up at Lakeview Desert. It's a wild rice lake. There's also some camps and resorts around that. There are a couple friends of mine who said, oh, I've always wanted to paddle. Can I paddle with you the first day? I've never paddled at headwaters, blah, blah, blah. Come to find out, I think that they were like, Ruth, you're going to need some help. They didn't say this, so we want to paddle with you. And actually, I was very happy to have Denny Kneff with me from the River Alliance and Brian Pierce from the Northwoods Land Trust, because there were a whole bunch of beaver dams, and you saw my boat is fabric. So even though they had little plastic boats, they could just like zoom up and tip over a beaver dam. I couldn't do that. I had to get out, and we would lift my boat over the beaver dam. So like I said, the water level is really low. There's a measuring stick at the outflow of Lakeview Desert, and I had read online that if the measuring stick is less than 6 inches, you can't canoe it. So guess what it was the day I got there? It was 5.5. I figured, I've committed, it's public, people are expecting me to go. The water was super clear there. You also could see freshwater mussels, which are a good indicator of clean water. So one thing that surprised me that I didn't know was going to happen is that people wanted to paddle with me. And I said, if you can find me, that's fine. You have to kind of get there on your own, because I just am moving. And that's why I had that really elaborate chart of all the road crossings and stuff. So Denny Kneff with the River Alliance said he wanted to paddle with me the first day. The first, and most of you probably know, gosh, I don't know if I'm doing that or...
We like that all.
I know, it's very cute. Thank you for helping.
I think it's just technical difficulties, so I'll just...
Okay, thank you.
At least it works for a little bit.
So what ended up happening is people would paddle with me, and so when I got to a town and meet with the reporters, I would talk about the local conservation groups and what they do. So we get to Eagle River, I talked about the River Alliance of Wisconsin and how they support local river groups all over Wisconsin, about how they had a state grant cut from the budget. And so Denny taught me more about the River Alliance. I'm now a member. I really love that group. And the first night I had on the river was a supermoon and a lunar eclipse. I don't know if you remember that 2.5 years ago. And I felt this is a good omen. This is a good omen for me. So this was wonderful to have that help on the first day. I came down into Eagle River, and then this happened again. So the Northwoods Land Trust, and the first part of the river is a lot of alder swamps. The river is about as deep as this cup of water. I was pulling my boat a lot, which explains the previous picture, because there wasn't enough water to actually float. So after getting over all the beaver dams, then going through an alder swamp, and then there's a really beautiful stretch around McNaughton. I'm not sure if I have the name right. coming into Eagle River. And so there was a young woman in the Land Trust office who wanted to paddle with me for days. So then she taught me about the Northwoods Land Trust. And then we met with the newspaper and they did a story about the work that, it turns out the Northwoods Land Trust has protected voluntarily with landowners who have put voluntary conservation easements on their land, 7 miles of the river. That's a lot of river frontage to have protected. So I was glad to learn their story and then to share it with the Eagle River newspaper. So one of the problems with the Wisconsin River is that it's, you know that saying, it's the hardest working river in North America because there are 26 dams, hydro dams on the river. And that makes it kind of a pain in the butt to paddle. And so going around dams was going to be a problem because you have to portage around them. Although by law, the dams do have to provide a throughway for people who are traveling. So this is an example of a portage at the first dam I came to at Eagle River. And when you get across the portage, this is how I would cross it. So at the beginning of the portage, I would take all my gear out, put it in my Duluth pack, put that on my back, and then I had a little cart where I'd put the wheels on the cart, strap my kayak on it, and then I would pull it behind me. And so that worked really well because it would not work well for portaging a kayak in the boundary waters. And you know the problem with putting a kayak on your shoulders is that you're walking around like this because your head's in the cockpit and you can't see anything. So it doesn't portage like a canoe would portage. And so I pulled it on this cart and that worked pretty good, except for I'll tell you a story when we get down to Merrill about what happened after that. But this is generally how I got around portages. And also, if I was lucky and knew someone in a town, they would help drive me around the portage. Because I said, I don't have to prove anything to anybody. I was 55 years old, and I don't have to, like paddle every inch and portage every inch. Because I just was out there kind of to make a point about these budget cuts. This is a typical site on the northern stretch. Some people say the first 95 miles and the last 95 miles are the most beautiful part of the river. And I have to say, I agree, there's a lot of working river and a lot of dams in between. But this is like a Boundary Waters campsite. And this is just below Rhinelander just below Eagle River, I think, at Rainbow Rapids. And I was very surprised when I got there. I had this remote wilderness sort of evening. The next morning I got up there. Actually, was a picnic table there, which was a huge luxury. And about 6 a.m. I'm sitting at the picnic table eating my granola, and 2 golden retrievers come running up. I'm like, where'd they come from? What are they doing here? Because there's no roads around or anything. And it turns out there were some duck hunters coming in. So some of the birds that I would see, I think a lot of the migration was happening and had already gone ahead of me. But every day I would see common mergansers, lots of kingfishers, eagles, wood ducks, and teal. Those are the main birds that I was seeing on the water, and coots as well. And I said, I hope I'm not going to ruin your hunting experience. They're like, no, you're just flushing up the birds for us. So I get into Rhinelander, and this is what I would try to do. The name of this trip ended up being I Heart Wisconsin River. And Tom Giroux is a member of the Natural Resources Foundation. I wonder if I'm touching something. And he had said, is there any way we can help? Our house is right on the river. I'm like, are you kidding? Yeah. So, it was really important for me to try to time it so I might get there around dinner time. And Steve, his partner, is a chef. And I could recite the whole dinner, but I won't. But just to tell you, it was really, really good. So he picked me up at the dam, took me to their house, which is just below the dam. I had a great dinner, and then this. And right out there is the Wisconsin River, right through the window. So I didn't feel I was cheating too much by having a beautiful bubble bath there in Eagle River, or in Rhinelander. It was starting to get kind of cold at night. Like I said, I started at the end of September. And so I was getting some frost. And for some reason, I just hadn't packed. All I had was day clothes and night clothes, and I wore the same clothes every day. And I just wasn't warm enough at night, so they also gave me some pajamas. So every time I put on my Homer Simpson pajamas, I had a little chuckle, and I was very warm every night after that. There were many people with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources who resonated with this trip. There, for example, Sue and Scott Watson. Sue was a water quality biologist with the department, now retired. She told me at Hat Rapids, this area where we were at, used to be a layer of scum on the river this deep, 1.5 to 2 feet. She said it looked like it was solid, like you could actually walk across it. That was, I guess I just never even knew the Wisconsin River looked like that, but there was outfall coming straight from pulp plants was the main source of it at that time. So in the mid-70s, when the Clean Water Act was passed, it just changed everything, and it really made a difference cleaning up the Wisconsin River and many other rivers. And if you've ever heard Bob Martini speak, and he's a good one to come in and do a program on the Clean Water Act, he says that a lot of the pulp companies found ways that their waste products could actually be sold for money. So it was actually economically in their best interest also to make the best use of all the waste products from their production. So anyhow, Scott and Sue said they were going to paddle with me that day at Hat Rapids. I didn't know what that meant. I did not know what Hat Rapids meant. Now, I should have, but there's not like a guide to every part of the Wisconsin River. There's guides to some parts in the north, and there's tons of maps and guides to the lower Wisconsin. I didn't really understand that that meant whitewater. So luckily, they're very experienced in whitewater, and so I followed them through rock gardens and so on. I would follow their path because they knew how to read the river. And I learned a lot from them. And this is an example. There's a little video here. Let me figure out how to turn on. Isn't this beautiful? This is the, whoops. Oh, it's a different owl. There we go. This is called Whirlpool Rapids. So I obviously portaged, they ran it. And then their friend Brian came behind me because unlike the beauty and grace of Scott and Susan running the rapids, I would usually get hung up on a rock, and you know when you're in a boat and it twirls around because the rock is right under you? Brian would come and he'd like, heave ho, and he'd kind of heave me off the rock. So you never could plan this kind of thing. It was pure luck that people wanted to help, and they really wanted to help bring attention to these budget cuts. Here's another beautiful campsite on Menard Island. I wanted to share 3 things that I learned about gear if you're going to be doing camping. One is, inside the tent you'll see a white floor. This is actually just a discarded piece of Tyvek, that house wrap. It's real strong, but it's lightweight, and I put it inside my tent, and I also have a ground cloth outside my tent just to protect the floor, because the floor and the zippers, that's what usually gives out on a tent. And also, you know, I would always wear earrings, and I could take them off and put them on there, and in the morning I could find them because it was light instead of dark. Then as far as my maps, I actually just used gazetteer pages because I could not find very good river maps. So if I got lost, I would pull out that iPhone and I would use a GPS, which would tell me my location. And then I would use these GPS maps to figure out which way to go. And you're like, well, you're on a river. What's the problem? You know, just go down the river. Well, with 26 dams on the river and all those flowages that back up, you get a lot of bays, and sometimes it's very hard to find where the outlet is to continue going down the river. And the third thing I wanted to point out for people of my age is this beautiful sleeping pad. So I had not bought any new gear since I was like in college, and there have been just huge advances in the quality of camping gear. including sleeping pads, which now cost over $100. But I tell you, I slept better on this pad than I did at home. Not only was it insulated, it had like 6 inches of air and foam and fiberfill and all kinds of good stuff in there. This is Dave and Joyce Wiesenecker from Tomahawk. Dave was the state parks director for the DNR for 17 years. He really, really believed in this trip because the state parks had just been eliminated. Your property taxes have been eliminated as a source of funding for the state parks. And now we have seen some of the results, and I didn't want people to forget that this had happened, that there used to be property tax support of our state parks. So what I wanted to share with you, besides they met me on the river in Tomahawk, they took me out to eat, they put me up at their house, they took me out to eat again for breakfast, and then they put me back on the river. So they were tremendous. But one thing they did, and there's another couple, if I have your permission to tell your story, Jim, you're married, they set up a permanent endowment with the foundation. An endowment is where you put the principal in, and then every year the earnings, about 5% or 4%, will be taken and used for the purpose. For them, it was to help state parks. Their state parks endowment goal that they're working on is $500,000. So this has built boardwalks in state parks, interpretive signage, trails, and all that sort of thing. And we have 2 people in the room tonight who've done the same thing for water. The Wisconsin Water Protection Fund was set up by Jim and Mary Glavin just 2 weeks ago. We signed the papers, they're right here in the front row, for support of Wisconsin water, especially organizations that work on water or anything that Jim and Mary decide. So people like that are just heroes to me. They know what's most important. Jim's been very involved as a citizen scientist, testing water quality, very involved with Trout Unlimited, knows how important water is. It's the lifeblood of Wisconsin, is water. And so when people do this sort of thing, I'm in awe and also in honor of people who set up endowments like this. And we now have 90-some like that. I continue down the river. There's this great historic part. Some of you maybe are familiar. This is the blaze of the Ice Age Trail. It has a nice run here along a water diversion that is by Grandmother Falls. And this is, the water is going through these old 100-year-old pipes. I understand last year maybe they just replaced these. And on a July day, I can imagine doing this portage. It'd be really nice to have water spraying up and cooling me down and all that. But I tell you, in October, it was no fun. And also, I did this really, really ridiculous thing. I thought, oh, I'll do a video of me doing this portage. So I put the camera on the boat and I pushed it in front of me so the camera would be looking at me. And then I tripped over this cement thing, fell on my boat, and I broke a rib on the boat. So I get down the rest of the day. I mean, it was a top rib of the boat that kind of went down across the back. So I kept going that day, and I pulled into Merrill, and I looked up to my left, and there was an Ace hardware store. And I went up there, and they not only found one solution, they found 2 solutions to fix the brake on the frame in my kayak. And it was just wonderful. So that's the thing about the Wisconsin River. Like every 10 miles or more, there's going to be a little city. It was built as a river town, and that's how far you could get in a day if you had a horse and wagon. This was the place coming into Merrill that in my experiences, I had driven that, I don't know, maybe 50 times, going from Bayfield down to Madison and back up. And I would look down and say, wow, that's a pretty river. When I came around this bend and I saw that bridge, I almost started crying. I couldn't believe it. I said, I can't believe I'm really here, that this really is happening. And you can make it happen. And it was just like this aha moment that if you want to do it, just do it. And it worked out. And there it was. And there were a lot of huge piles, like 20 feet across piles of mussel shells. And I had taken a photo, and then they had put it on the website, and I'm like, what is this from? And most people thought it was probably otters going and eating the mussels and dropping the shells all in one place. this is a video too, if you want to touch the screen. So coming into Wausau, there's some beautiful stretches. There's a stretch called Granite Cliffs, which is great. You know, this was the time of night where you love it in early autumn with the golden sun coming in from the side. This was probably 5:30 at night. It starts getting dark around 6. I knew I was coming into Wausau, so I could do more miles. This was probably the day I did the most miles. I think it was 26 or 27 miles.
Wow.
And the water was just absolutely perfect. However, there's one dam there that was blown up but never removed, called the Brokaw Dam. And most people run it, but there's pieces of rebar sticking up. So if you have a plastic boat, you can do that. But I couldn't do that. And it took me almost an hour just to get around this one set of rubble that's left in the river that really needs to be pulled out. So this is just a part of the beautiful stretch in Wausau. I had great weather for most of the trip. There were some days that it rained, but when you're in a kayak, you have a spray skirt, and if you put your raincoat on, it's almost easier just to keep paddling than to get out, string a tarp, get wet while you're doing that, you know, and sit there and shiver in the cold. It was easier for me to just keep going. I stayed that night with Peg Mallory. I put this picture in here in case any of you know her. She just passed on in September. She was paddling. She just loved paddling in every form. Last time I paddled with her was at Horicon Marsh. She was on the board of the Natural Resources Foundation. And so she and her husband Tuck also live on the river. So I got to stay a second time at someone's house right on the river. So then I come into Stevens Point, and having gone to school here, I was excited about that. And this friend of mine, Tracy Haynes, who's with the Wisconsin Wetlands Association, he called me up before the trip and he said, "Ruth, can I paddle with you when you're coming into Point?" I said, "Tracy, the day is yours, whatever you want to do." So it actually ended up being kind of a rest day for me because he had done his graduate work here on the wetlands on the river just upstream of Point. He had mapped the bottom of the river and the vegetation. And at that time, there were no duck blinds. There was very little recreation in that part of the river. I had friends who lived up there. We never went on the river. It just wasn't even part of our life at that time. But he had done his research there, and it turns out we were here at the same time. We just didn't know each other. So he set up a day where the swamp students came out, and that's Stevens Point students who are wetland, Alan, you probably know swamp students for wetland management and protection, I think. It came out, and Lyle Nauman came out, who was Tracy's advisor. This is Paul Smith from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel taking notes. You know, maybe he was going to do an article. I had no idea. I'm like, we're just moving. And so it was really a great experience. So I put a few extra slides in here because it was great to have the students come and to have that energy, and also to really just encourage them to do their dreams, whatever it is that they do. And already by loving wetlands, they are doing a great job. And so we went out in the wetlands area. Tracy taught us about, this was one of the students who was out hunting ducks that morning. Tracy said when he was, this is Lyle Nauman, when he was a student, there were no duck blinds, and when we were out there just for part of a day, we saw 25 duck blinds. That's how much the water quality has improved, including food for ducks, including this wild celery, which he said he never saw in 1985-86, never found wild celery. Now it's found in many lakes around Wisconsin, but as some of you probably know, it's a favorite food of waterfowl. And it was everywhere. It was great to see the rebound of this area just upstream here. Does anybody know this guy, Chuck? And this is Brian Tim Byers. So Tim and Cindy put me up at the night. And then Chuck is with the Wetland Conservation League, a group here in Stevens Point that I never knew about, that I learned about. Anybody here a member? Just a wonderful group. These are people who love wetlands because they love duck hunting. And so when we pulled into Bubolt's Park here and pulled our boats up, all the students and Tracy and the reporter and everything, these guys had a picnic with a grill going with brats, and in fact, coming from Iowa, I never knew what a brat was. And then when I went to school here, I learned about brats. So they made a picnic for us. It was wonderful. That didn't happen anywhere else on the river. It was so great to have a hot lunch and to stay in town with Tim and Cindy. Then the next morning, Chuck came and took me back to the river. So he took me around the dam right here, and then he took me around, you probably all know the spillway, and he said he has actually seen a canoe, a mother and son go over the spillway. I really didn't want to do that, so he took me down right below the spillway and put me in the river. And then you come down in Buren flowage. So the flowages can be really tough because they're wide open, you get a lot of wind. And rain, like I mentioned, is not a huge problem for canoes or kayaks. Wind is a huge problem for canoes and kayaks. It's probably the thing I'm most scared of is wind. So you come into these big flowages, and sometimes there could be a lot of motorboats and also a lot of wind. But this was where I saw the most beautiful fall flowage. So I was coming into the Rapids area here, and Petenwell flowage and Castle Rock flowage. And this is where I confess I didn't paddle those because of the big wide open water. So I said, I need some help. Can somebody get me so that I can put in right here and not have to do the dams? There's a couple dams at Rapids, and also do the big open flowages. And someone who I never knew said, oh, I'll come help you, but I don't have a rack on my car. I don't have a trailer. I'm not sure what we're going to do with your boat. And I said, no problem, because remember my boat? So you can hit video here. There's a lot of gear in that boat. Plus, at that point, it was leaking, and I was sitting in a couple inches of water, so you see me tipping it up to try to get the water out sometimes.
You're getting faster at it.
The hardest part is putting it together. So here she is in her little Ford Pinto. What do you think about that, huh? It's pretty nice. There's my boat. So then I continued down the river there just below Castle Rock. I'm starting to come into the middle part, or what I consider the middle part of the river, which is the upper dells, like from the Lemon River down. And I had worked at the 4-H camp there, just outside of the dells, Upham Woods. And I started to recognize some of the terrain. This is Louis Bluff, which is a landmark, has petroglyphs on the top, very important site for Ho-Chunk tribes. And there was a reporter from the dells who was like calling me, and it's the weirdest thing to be paddling a boat and your phone rings. And he kept calling me, where are you now, where are you now, where are you, you know, and so I was like talking with him all the way down into the dells, and he did a wonderful story about the budget situation and the river. There were a couple Natural Resource Foundation members who said, we have a place on the river. This is how it kind of picked up steam, you know? And they said, this is Frank and Mariana Weinhold. We'd love to have you stay with us. In fact, Mariana, she paddles the river every day. Now she's 78 years old. And so she actually paddled with me the second day. So they put me up that night. This is just the beginning of the dells. And the next morning was an interview with Joy Cardine. And you know what time her radio show starts? 6 a.m. And I was really worried of oversleeping, so I didn't sleep at all that night, even though I was in this beautiful bed and just had a wonderful dinner, because I was so afraid I was going to oversleep. So I woke up at 4 a.m. and sat around until the interview happened. So then she paddled with me, and this is a little video. Has anybody here paddled the Upper Dells? It's very beautiful, and if you've been on a boat trip, you've seen it. And it's a place where they say the river, which is pretty wide coming down out of Wausau, they say the river turns on its edge. So you get to this place called the Narrows, which was infamous in the logging days, because there would be log jams there that would be jammed up for like weeks and weeks at a time. There were many deaths there at the Narrows. And also there was a turn. So we were coming through Coldwater Canyon, which is one of the side canyons. But I love where rock hits water. And if you're interested, even taking a regular boat, the tourist trip, it's a beautiful experience. And you just have to kind of get over that you're in the Dells and go, this is a beautiful river. It's why it became a tourist destination, was because of the beautiful rocks. The portage through the Dells, you can imagine. Just imagine the worst portage you've ever had, garbage strewn everywhere, gullies washed out everywhere, dumpsters overflowing, and that was the portage through the Dells. But you get to the lower part, and it's beautiful again. And so the way you can see this either is by your own boat or those amphibious ducks. And that's a really beautiful tour too. So there are some wonderful ways you can experience nature at Wisconsin Dells. And I did learn the very first talk that I ever gave was for the stewards of the Upper Dells. And they were successful in putting a 10-mile-per-hour no-wake zone on the Upper Dells. Because when the river turns on its side and the cliffs are in tight, you get a ton of rebound off the cliffs. And it swamps canoes. Now the tour boats are very sensitive to that. But there's an outfitter that has like a jet boat, which essentially does wheelies on the water. And I was there when a jet boat came through, and it was not fun as a paddler. But I highly recommend paddling the Dells during the week, not the weekend, and maybe off-season. Like September, October was a great time to paddle the Dells. There's beautiful rock formations and sandy beaches. So now it's getting into a totally different landscape of the driftless area, kind of transitioning out of the central sands into the driftless area that had not been glaciated. And I was heading down towards Aldo Leopold's shack, where a friend of mine, Mike Mossman, who you probably all know because he was one of the key bird researchers in our state and is actually nationally known for his bird research work. He and his wife Lisa said they'd like to meet me there, and they got permission that we actually could camp at Aldo Leopold's shack. It was like going to Mecca. So, So I pulled in there about sunset. I saw their boat, and there were probably 1,000 cranes circling and congregating on the flats. If you ever have a chance, we have some field trips. The Leopold Foundation has field trips. You probably see it here maybe along the river, where they come in at night. They feed in the fields during the day, and they come in at night. And I probably saw 1,000 cranes coming in all around his shack. But you know, when he was there working, there were no cranes like that. There were very few sandhill cranes in Wisconsin. He never experienced what we are experiencing now today, thanks to the work people have done, like with Audubon societies and clubs and so on. So we stayed up almost all night. Mike and Lisa had brought some venison, potatoes they had dug from their garden, some wine in plastic bottles because no glass on the river. And Mike can build a fire anywhere. He built a fire in a little pan so we wouldn't leave any coals on the Leopold shack area. And we talked about Leopold and the difference that he's made in this world, not even just Wisconsin, but he was the first writer of a game management textbook. So I'm sure that has influenced wildlife biologists and their training ever since he published the game management textbook. Not to mention the Sam County Almanac, which has been printed in 30-some foreign languages, and his land ethic that we are part of the network of nature. There's Mike. He said this is his favorite view of the shack. If you've been there, you may not have seen this view because this is kind of from the Parthenon. That was the outhouse. This is the back approach from the river, and as most of you probably have read, Aldo Leopold would scavenge lumber that washed down the river and turn this shack, which had been a chicken coop. It kind of built it out, but not very much. I mean, they mostly cleaned it out, and then using just all this lumber they had found in the river, there's some bunk beds in there, and the door, and everything is just handmade out of this chicken coop. And so the next morning, the scientists came in, Mike Mossman and Georgie Steele, And they taught me about this important bird area. And we have an endowment for important bird areas that helps benefit these special habitat areas that are important in some part of the bird's life cycle, where they nest, where they mate, where they stop over, wherever in their life cycle. We have 60 or more important bird areas in Wisconsin. I am embarrassed to say I didn't know anything about important bird areas. It's actually a global system, and now that I've traveled more, I see IBAs all over the world. But here's what the kind of research that we are missing now. This is 25 years of transect studies, and you can probably barely see the white lines and the dots that go across. Every 25 meters is a point where Mike would go, the 25 meters, he would stop, he would say, what birds am I hearing or seeing, what vegetation is here, for this entire Leopold Pines important bird area. If you're going down on the interstate and you go through Portage, right before Portage you see the signs. That's this site. It's an important bird area. And so for setting up this sort of grid point study, and every 5 years it's monitored, was able to inform a very, very valuable land management plan. And one of Leopold's concepts was, you can't just manage your own land. Talk to your neighbors and see if you can manage the whole habitat, because that's where the value is having joint goals for management. So there's private land here, there's federal land here, the Leopold Foundation has land here, and they have learned that if you want to provide habitat for grassland birds, here are the things you need to do. Here's the vegetation that has to be here. It's pretty much a prescription to help every single landowner within this important bird area decide how they can manage their land in order to help birds. So I got to meet this guy, Jim Pines. His dad started that Dane trucking. If you ever see those trucks with the Great Dane on them, the semis, started that company. They became very wealthy, and they bought up a ton of land on the Wisconsin River because they loved it. He learned from this land management plan. He uses it to guide his decisions on his land. So he learned, like, this area, which was marginal farmland, was really hydric soils. It should be a wetland. So he, with some help, went in and broke the tiles. Of course, that would have just killed an Iowa farmer to have someone break the tiles. I appreciate that, being from Iowa. But they broke the tiles, which are the drains that are under the fields, and allowed the water to come back up and pool into wetlands. And the day we were there, there was probably 35,000 geese coming into his site. And he's actually made part of his land open to the public, so in the fall, you can go and see those incredible crane congregations that I mentioned earlier. This is like story of my life. Really, the river was so low 2 years ago, and then last year it was super high, and there was this young guy who did the same trip on a stand-up paddleboard. Did anyone see him when he came through here? Or Heedling, Greg Heedling, I think is his name. So he probably had a very different experience. And of course, most people would rather do this in the spring because your days are longer and you have more water. I was doing it in the fall. The days were short. If I didn't get off the water by 5, it was dark by 6. And so I didn't have that much time to actually travel. But it was just so low all along the way. So Mike and his wife Lisa paddled with me this day, because I have very few pictures actually of myself out on the river, but luckily he's into it. Came down through Merrimack. If any of you know Lake Wisconsin, and this is a video you can touch here. I found out afterwards it's also called the washing machine. So for like 10 seconds, I just took my hand off the paddle and I turned on this little camera, the video part of a camera, and it completely turned me around. It was just super windy, super choppy. It was like, I do not like this. You can see in the distance the railroad, there's a railroad bridge here, and then just beyond that, if you've ever taken the Merrimack Ferry across the Wisconsin River, which is a really fun thing to do. So I was hanging out in front of the ferry channel trying to figure out when to cross. I was watching the timing and trying to figure out when is the biggest window that I can cross. So when it got over here, I'm like, okay, go. And all of a sudden, get out of the ferry lane. They were yelling at me, get out of the ferry lane. I had to back up in this mess and chop. I actually had to paddle in reverse and go back upstream. It was such a pain in the butt. And you know, power boats are supposed to yield to paddle boats, but you know, it just didn't work that way. I get to the lower Wisconsin, and I'm almost finished now. You make a right-hand turn, you head west, which basically means you head into a wind tunnel. And that's what happened to me. It was like, I didn't get much help from the current, almost nowhere in the northern part except those one rapids that you saw, like going from maybe Rhinelander to Merrill, I would say I got help with the current. Otherwise, you're kind of paddling all the time. So I get to the lower Dells, and the Friends of the lower Wisconsin said, we'd like to come and meet you. I was camping at the Veterans Park in Sauk City, and they said, we'll be there Sunday morning at 8 a.m. So I envisioned, you know, some guys with canoes or kayaks. And they come and they had a motorboat. And I'm like, how is this going to work? And they're like, well, you know, we're going to zoom ahead to a spot where we want to share something with you, and then you paddle up and we'll tell you what's going on there. So they zoomed up to this spot. Right here is an outflow from the rural subdivision that when the water, when there's been a lot of rain and the ground gets waterlogged and so on, their septic systems are actually going straight into that to about 2 miles away and coming into the river. And this Friends of the Lower Wisconsin has been trying to bring that to the attention of the state and the town for years, and nothing has ever been able to be resolved about that. They also shared with me Cheryl and Doug Jones, who live on the Wisconsin River. This is a lagoon they used to swim in. And these pipes that they're standing over are groundwater monitors, because it turns out they can no longer drink the tap water. They have to have a very expensive remote, what is it called, reverse osmosis filter. And so they're like, where is this coming from? So at their own expense, they put in 10 groundwater monitoring wells here. And once a month, a scientist comes, pulls the samples out, and sends them to the state. And they're trying to figure out, why is their nitrate level so high? Why is it 4 times the health level that's allowed? And it's not just them. It turns out there's 26 other sites where people are now not able to drink from their well. So starting at the Dells and going down is when I first really started to see the problem of excess nutrients and a lot of algae growth in the water. And I did not drink or filter water from the river. I actually carried a lot of water with me, which was hard. So every time I came to a town, the first thing I do is look for a park where there's a water tap so I could fill up my water again. But they are just frustrated with what's happening and what's contributing to their problem. Most of you probably know the area around Spring Green. It's like an old riverbed, so it's very flat, and then it goes up into the driftless hills. And so it's farmed a lot, and it's sand. So whatever is being applied on the farm fields is going into their water table, and that's probably the source of their water quality problems. So every little town along here, there were regional papers who needed content, you know, so they would come and interview me, and we would talk about whatever I had learned that day. And so I hope that that made a difference for their water quality. This was another cool thing I learned about that same season that I did my trip. Uncle and 2 kids drowned on the river, and they didn't have to. They were playing on a sandbar, and most of you know at the end of a sandbar drops off. It gets really fast. And they actually panicked. They fell into that, and they panicked, and they drowned. If they had been wearing a life vest, they would have survived. And so the Lower Wisconsin Friends of Lower Wisconsin are working with the DNR, and they put up 10 of these stands, and people are using them. You come during the day. If you don't have life jackets for yourself or your kids, you borrow them. Use them all for the day, and then if you go down the river, you come out at the next boat launch, and you can hang them up there. So I am confident that this initiative has saved lives. on the lower Wisconsin River. So, do you see where I am in this photo? So, I was pretty familiar with the lower Wisconsin. I have to say, the only night I had to pay any money at all to camp was Mosinee at Council Grounds State Park. I paid $23, and then there wasn't much. It was after hours and there was no change. So I think I ended up paying $30. Otherwise, you don't, this is public land. This belongs to all of us, which is such a treasure for us as United States citizens to have public lands like this. The lower Wisconsin River was designated as a special waterway to be protected for migratory waterfowl, for wildlife. There's 18, I think, different state natural areas and wildlife areas. There's even a mussel bed that's protected here on the Wisconsin River. I'm standing at this, I'm not standing, a friend of mine is standing on top of Ferry Bluff, which is a beautiful state natural area with a goat prairie, meaning a very high, dry, high-quality prairie. In fact, right now there's probably pasque flowers blooming on this prairie. And she took this picture of me down here. And this is what I originally thought the I Heart Wisconsin was going to be about. One person trying to say, hey, I'm only one person, but I'm trying to make a difference. But what really happened was, no, it's all of us. Because almost every day, I'd say there were only 3 days I paddled alone. Every other day, people were paddling with me who inspired me and told me about all the positive things that happened, regardless of the state budget. Look at the Aldo Leopold Audubon Society right here. You do not have to hang on to the state budget. You do your work no matter what happens with the state budget. And that's the sort of stories that started picking up and that I would share with the media as I went down the river. Mike and Lisa just couldn't stay away. She had 1 day of vacation teaching, and they came back on my second to last day of paddling. And it was super windy and super cold. And I usually had crackers, peanut butter, gorp, and carrots. Well, I told you Mike can kindle a fire anywhere. So here we are pulled off on a sandbar, which this is the beauty of camping on the lower Wisconsin. You pull off on sandbars, and they're so friendly and warm and comfortable, and the river's not really that deep. It looks huge, but it's really not that deep. And so he makes a little fire, and then he starts making some soup, and next thing you know, he's like, would you like some Thai peanut soup? I'm like, what? Are you kidding me? Of course. Like a real meal? Wow, you know, take the time out in the middle of the day. So they paddled with me on my last, second to last day, which was really nice. And it was hard, I lost it again. It was hard when I left them at Woodman because they had to go back to work the next day. And I kept paddling on. I wanted to try to get the last sandbar before I get to Bridgeport, which was where, I don't know why this happened, but there were people who wanted to make a flotilla on my last day, and so I had, for some reason, promised I would be there at 12 noon. You never want to do that on an 18-day trip. I mean, who knows where you're going to be when? And so I was really, like, worried about it, so I just paddled like crazy after Mike and Lisa left to go home that night, and ended up camping on what turns out was the very last sandbar. And at this point, I was feeling, I wanted to slow the trip down because I really like the simplicity of you wake up in the morning and you paddle, and then you have your meals, and then you go to bed. I got more sleep because I'd sleep from like 7 at night until 6 the next morning, tons of sleep. And it was just a simple life, and I loved it. And I was moving all the time. I never got stiff. When I got back to the office and I'm sitting in front of a computer, oh my gosh, would I get stiff, and I still do. It's like, I'd much rather be doing this. So I wanted it to slow down, but on the other hand, I knew I had to meet these people the next morning, well, at noon. But this is what I woke up to. It was like, oh man, I can't even see the river. But something very cool happened during that time while I was waiting for the fog to burn off. You know how sometimes you go out at nighttime and you hear the migration of the birds? Mm-hmm. Because many of the migrations happen at night. This was very early in the morning, and I was laying there, and I started hearing these wings and hoots, like contact calls, hoot, 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 and little clucks and little sounds that birds are making, for 20 minutes, there was a stream of birds migrating right over my campsite. And of course they were coming down a river as a landmark is a migration pathway, and they were going to one of the greatest migration pathways in the world, which is the Mississippi River. It was only 9 miles away. So I just sat there and thought of the wonder of these blue-winged teal and kingfishers and scaup and coots and everything just flying over and flying. And they knew where to go. And it was, I will never forget that experience. So I'm glad that the river was fogged in. And this is sort of typical setup. That's my little camp stove that collapses down. And then I just had a bowl and a spoon and a cup. And that's all you need when you go camping. I mean, otherwise you're just like washing all these dishes all the time and everything. So this was the first day I took a selfie. You can tell I hate, so I didn't even know what a selfie was. I tried to do it. I didn't even get my face all the way in it. But I did turn on this video thing, and I kind of did this stream of consciousness for about 2 minutes where I was thanking people. And so you can go see that, because all this was put on this website. Just Google I Heart Wisconsin, and you'll be able to hear, if you want to just listen to my daily journals, which were pure stream of consciousness, including this last day. And it's funny because Lisa said, "Oh, your hair looks like a court jester," because I just had this band and it would stick up above it. And I said, "Yeah, I haven't brushed it for 18 days." So I did get there. I think it was around noon. People came. They brought their dog. They brought all their boats. We were all going to go down to Mississippi together. So we get down to the confluence. And the cliffs across, that's Iowa, across the way, Pikes Peak State Park, was blocking all the wind, which was just huge relief after 5 days of wind in my face. And it was 70 degrees on October 14th. It was the most beautiful day I couldn't have asked for a better day. So we, right at the confluence, we pulled off. You can see the tip of that sandbar right there. And we took a break, and luckily we did, because then 2 barges came up and they really shoved the water in front of them. And so there would be these waves that were maybe a couple feet high coming at us, and luckily we were off the river watching it. But there was one guy, Dan Goltz, who also climbs trees for eagle banding and brings eagles down. So he's an adventurer. He rushed out there to surf on the barges. So that was pretty cool. We pulled, and there's a water trail you pull in through Wyalusing State Park. It's marked, you know how to get there, otherwise it would be very confusing. And we pull in there, and the Friends of Wyalusing are there, and had a little, some of my coworkers came down, and I still have some of those t-shirts. So if you want a t-shirt, take it, and if you want to donate a few bucks or whatever, that's fine. They're all either extra large or double extra large, but I still have them. So some of my coworkers came down because they had been following this day by day. And what's really funny is, like, halfway through the trip when I was in Tomahawk, this guy's on his deck, and I said, "Oh, I'm at the 100-mile mark. Would you mind taking my picture?" And he did, and he goes, "I read about you in the newspaper." I'm like, "What?" And it turns out it was in the Wisconsin State Journal, and I didn't even know that that had happened. And it turns out people started following the trip, like, each day, which it's a good thing I didn't know that, because I would have become a lot more self-conscious. So anyhow, these people made that happen. They would put my pictures on the website, and they would put my dictation that I would do every night on the website. Had a cake, finished there, and this is a page. So if you Google I Heart Wisconsin, each one of these is a day on the river. So there's 18 different posts where you can, if you want to learn more about this specific days on the trip. And then I just wanted to, I don't know, can you just take me back to those greeting slides at the beginning about the bird fund? So what's really interesting, there's a special edition of our newsletter on that table back there about the river trip. I already told you why I thought I was doing this trip. What I didn't realize at all was I was actually doing it for my mother, because she never got the chance to do something like that. I told you about how she took me out on field trips when I was a little girl. She loved nature. She died early from early onset of Alzheimer's, and it was completely unfair that she could not have the second half of her life. And so if any of you have ever been in that situation where you've lost someone close to you, you're trying to live for two. Have you ever had that feeling? You're trying to live for them as well because they never had the chance. So as I was putting together my thoughts for that newsletter, I realized this trip was really about my mother. And so it's just interesting why people do stuff like that. But one of the biggest things that came out of it is just find your prairie, find your river, do your dream. Because I never thought at that age that I would just do a trip like that. And I could only do it because of all the people that helped me. So the second lesson was we're all in this network together to support all of our fellow inhabitants of this beautiful earth. So just to finish up, because this is a Audubon Club, I wanted to tell you about our birdathon. If you want to raise money for birds and also yourself, just form a team and go out and bird. And then ask your friends and family if they'd support you. It's for a worthy cause. And your team keeps half of the proceeds. So if you're doing it for the Leopold Audubon Club, then you get to keep half the money. So it's really cool. There are all kinds of cute, I wish we had some of the names. Oh, these are the different ways that people are doing the birdathon. This is John Craniac. He makes a mimosa and goes out and sits in his backyard. Whatever he sees that day is his birdathon. You know, people do it different ways. These people bike, our group hikes. There's some people who do it only on the water, and some people who do the 24-hour birdathon. But it's just a fun way to raise money. And the Bird Protection Fund, here's some of the different Sleepy, Feel the Birders, warbling on the Wee-ah-wash, Obie Gray, and the Chewbacca-lackas. You know, it's just a really fun thing to do. So if you want to get together and have a birdathon team, it's a fun thing to do. And I'll just finish up about some of the projects that our foundation through this bird fund has funded. Bird City, as Kent mentioned, the Bird Cities project. We funded stopover trainings for public land managers and land owners. We actually fund some places, reforestation in Central America, where our birds go in the wintertime, so that there are forests for them to live in during the wintertime. This Bird Protection Fund also funds whooping crane research and reintroduction. We fund the radio tracking interns who follow every single crane every single day. And several, the Wisconsin Bird Atlas. So it's the Bird Protection Fund is really important to our state, and it has now funded $890,000 towards bird habitat, bird research, bird education. So if you want to be part of that, you can do that through the Birdathon, and that's a cool way to do it. So thank you for listening to my adventure, and happy, if there's time, I don't know, for questions. Otherwise, I'll hang around by the table. There's field trip booklets there, and our magazine is there too.